The trooper's knuckles tapped twice on the sleeper door before he opened it without waiting. The midday light off I-80 came in harsh and flat, the color of road salt. "Raymond McKenna?" he said, filling the doorway with a winter jacket and the smell of coffee. "Step down from the cab. Hands where I can see them." Ray blinked, breath caught between the hint of diesel and his own sweat. He'd shaved at dawn at a pilot in Toledo, thinking he'd make Joliet by lunch and home by tomorrow night. Instead, the way station sign had flashed open and a trooper with a sharp crew cut and no patience had walked him through a level 1 inspection so thorough it felt personal. Now 2 more patrol cars idled in the lot, exhaust drifting sideways like a low cloud. "What's this about?" he asked, stepping down. Knees stiff. 52 and he still moved like he was splitting firewood, careful and economical, thanks to old habits and a lower back he didn't entirely trust. The trooper turned him toward the hood and clicked a cuff around his right wrist. "Stolen cargo. Sealed trailer that isn't sealed. Dispatch says you signed out the load and tampered with it. We've got a report of missing goods, electronics. You got anything you want to say?" Ray stared at his reflection in the chrome, the warped image of a man with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that seldom gave more than they took. "My seal was good at the last stop," he said. "I logged every mile. Check the ELD." "We did," the trooper said. "Looks like someone learned to edit." Round the other wrist. The metal bit his skin. Ray breathed through the tightness in his chest and thought of his wife, Nora, in their small Ohio house, the one with the lemon tree she kept alive under grow lights despite Midwest winters. He thought of their son, Liam, still not answering texts as often as he used to since that argument about college loans. The cuffs clicked. Somewhere behind him a CB crackled with truckers calling mile markers and towns he knew by the shape of their silos. He started to speak and stopped. He had learned in the Army that there are bad moments you can talk your way into making worse. So he looked at the officer, steady. "I want a phone call." "You'll get one," the trooper said, "after we finish here." They walked him past the fat ribbon of interstate and down the strip of gravel littered with chain links, broken glass, one torn bungee. The spring wind was all exhaust and corn stubble. Ray watched a semi glide onto the scales and thought, this isn't just a mistake. It's a setup. Ray grew up around weight and leverage. His father worked a crane at the port in Cleveland long enough to teach his kids that steel isn't stubborn if you respect its balance. Ray learned to lift with a straight back and set his feet. He learned that a yard of chain is a promise you make to physics. Do this and I will hold. He joined the Army at 19 because the world felt too wide and too simple at once. He liked rules that were clear and people you could count on because they had to. He liked the feeling of dawn formation, the way the air tasted clean if you woke before everyone else. He liked the hum of engines more than the crack of rifles, and he made sergeant before a piece of shrapnel put his right hip on a path to storm-predicting ache for the rest of his life. After the Army, trucks made sense. Big machines, straightforward problems, math you could do with your hands. He spent years pulling drive and coast to coast, then moved to regional to be home more when Nora went back to school to become an ultrasound tech. He missed birthdays and funerals and once the last 30 minutes of a Browns game that everyone said would have made him believe in miracles again. But he kept the mortgage current and he liked the way the highway let him think. He drove for Keller and Sons Logistics out of Akron, a company founded by a man with the look of a benevolent walrus and run now by that man's son, a sharp suit named Derek who had never sat a night in Wyoming with the wind trying to throw the truck into the ditch. Derek smiled the way some people held knives. Lightly, like they were extensions of their hands. Ray mostly dealt with dispatch. His dispatcher was a guy named Mason with a nickname no one used to his face. Mason was 30 and always 5 seconds from a better offer, as he said, while he clicked through screens in a dark bullpen that smelled like burnt coffee and pizza. Mason liked Ray because Ray didn't complain. Old school, he'd say into the headset, giving Ray a load to Chicago or Pittsburgh or the belt of warehouses that ringed Columbus like those little rubber belts in an engine. My steady Eddie. Ray would grunt and say he preferred Ray, and Mason would laugh. Roger that, Ray. That winter, Ray had started to notice things. Fuel receipts that didn't match the timing of his routes. ELD edits, tiny ones that moved a 10-minute break to look like it was anywhere but where Ray had taken it. A shipper who swore they'd unloaded one more pallet than Ray had tallied, then apologized the next day. It was background noise at first, the way life is full of little misalignments you don't bother straightening because who has time. The big misalignment came in March when Keller and Sons switched their ELD provider and told drivers to install new tablets in cabs. The old ones had been clunky but honest. The new ones were slick. They came with an app that could move a line of duty time a few minutes here and there to reflect reality. As the company video put it, with a smiling actor in a vest. Ray didn't like it. He logged strict even when it meant biting an extra hour on the side of the road because he'd run out of driving time 15 miles from a truck stop. He should have listened to that itch along his spine. The troopers searched the trailer. The seal was broken and retied sloppily. Ray watched the trooper's pen move across a clipboard with lines like tiny train tracks. He was careful with his anger because anger had always done him more harm than good. The army had taught him to put it into sandbags and miles and meals eaten quietly and deliberately. At the precinct in Joliet, they put him in a room with beige walls and a camera in the corner. A detective with a mustache that wanted to be a rulemaker slid a file across the table. "You took on a shipment of laptops yesterday," he said. "Left the shipper sealed. The warehouse this morning found 2 pallets short. We got surveillance of you parked for 47 minutes at a rest area where you clocked a 10. That's a long 10. You see our problem." Ray didn't sigh. He wanted to. "Check my trailer cam," he said, though he knew the newer cameras Keller and Sons had installed were motion-triggered and lately unreliable. "Check the yard cameras." I pulled straight out and back onto the interstate. The detective tapped the file. "Your dispatcher sent over your logs. Edited. Looks like you shifted some off-duty to hide the longer stop. Why would you do that?" "I didn't," Ray said. The detective watched him a long beat. Ray held his gaze. It wasn't defiance, just the math of a man who did not want to be lied about. The detective's eyes softened. "Barely. You a vet?" "Yes." The man nodded once, not sentimentally, something closer to respect for the fact that the calendar doesn't stop just because we are brave. "We'll keep you overnight," he said, not unkindly. "Let your company send their rep. If this is a clerical mess, they'll clear it." It wasn't. Keller and Sons sent a lawyer with a haircut so expensive it looked ordinary. He skimmed Ray's file, looked bored, and said the company would cooperate. He didn't look at Ray's hands, which were shaking. Not from fear but from the rage that comes when your name is being bent out of shape. By morning, they released him on his own recognizance with a court date and a stack of paper that felt like a joke. Forms stamped with codes and instructions written by someone who had never missed a day's pay. He called Nora. She picked up on the second ring. He heard her shift to a private room wherever she worked now, her hushed voice going tight. "What happened?" "It's not what you think," he said. "Cargo missing. They're saying." "We'll fix it," she said, fast like a breath. "Come home. We'll just come home." He drove his cab back to the yard and turned in his keys without being asked. Mason wasn't there that day. Derek was in a glass office with a view of the loading docks. He said the company had suspended Ray pending investigation. He didn't shake Ray's hand. Ray went home to a house that smelled like lemon leaves and clean laundry. He took off his boots at the door because he always had, even when it meant stepping on cold tile. He sat on the bottom stair and looked at his hands until Nora sat beside him and put a hand on his forearm. "We're going to fix it," she said again. He nodded. He did not trust his voice. When men like Ray break, they often do it quietly. They don't go looking for a fight because a fight is easy and life is not. He went to the courthouse for his arraignment and stood straighter than the judge, because posture was cheaper than pride. He pleaded not guilty and hired a local attorney who wore cheap suits but remembered his clients' names. He called the VA to check on what kind of counsel or help they could provide. He called a former sergeant he hadn't spoken to in years, because once you have shared MREs in silence you are allowed to call out of the blue. The sergeant listened, said, "Something's off," and told Ray to write down every detail he could remember. "Memory is funny," he said. "It gets shy when you need it. Put it on paper so it can't go anywhere." So Ray sat at the little IKEA desk in the spare room where Nora kept her sewing machine and a box of old photos, and he wrote. He wrote times and mile markers and the name of the bored woman who had signed the bills of lading in a cold warehouse in Gary. He wrote the name on a coffee receipt he'd stuck in his visor. He wrote that the ELD had glitched on Tuesday and lost 5 minutes he hadn't been able to retrieve until later when it reappeared like a ghost. He called Mason. It went to voicemail. "Hey, it's Ray," he said careful. "We have to talk. Call me." Mason didn't call. Instead, Human Resources did via email. "Pending the outcome of the investigation, we are terminating your employment for cause." There was a paragraph about benefits and a mention of his 401k. There was no mention of how a man looks at himself when he has been labeled a thief. Nora sat at the kitchen table with him at night and said, "We have savings." She said, "I can pick up more shifts." She said, "We can sell the F-150. And bit her lip, because it was the truck her father had given them 10 years ago, and where would Ray even put his hands if he didn't have that wheel? Ray went for runs. He hadn't been a runner in years because his hip argued with him, but he ran slow loops around their neighborhood anyway, early, before the retired men walked their dogs and judged each other's lawns. He talked to a therapist at the VA clinic who told him to breathe into his ribs and to tell his anger what he wanted it to do. Anger, she said, is just a tool with bad PR. He breathed. He wrote. He watched a documentary about a trucking company busted for fuel card skimming in Indiana. He paused it and stared at the screen because the numbers looked familiar. A few cents shaved from each fill-up, ghost charges at stations a driver never visited. A web of small theft that added up to a mortgage and a boat and someone's second house by a lake. He went to his desk and sorted his fuel receipts. He made a spreadsheet on paper because he trusted ink more than screens. He circled numbers. He saw patterns. And he felt it, the click, the way a chain seat settles when you've tightened it exactly right. He stopped sleeping through the night. He rose at weird hours and stood at the kitchen sink and let the cold water run over his wrists until his hands stopped shaking. He didn't tell Nora that sometimes he saw himself at 21, sitting on a cot in a canvas tent, watching his squad leader tape a broken rifle sling with a deliberateness that made Ray understand. In his bones, that precision is the one kindness we owe each other. He called Mason again. Voicemail. He called Derek's office. A woman with a voice like polished steel said Derek was unavailable. He left a message and did not expect a call back. He called the shipper in Gary and asked for the receiving clerk who had signed his paperwork. "We can't disclose anything," she said, bored, then lowered her voice. "But off the record, we've had issues. Not just you." "What issues?" he asked. She exhaled. "We had a driver last month all but accuse us of stealing from ourselves." A pause. Her voice got a little softer. "Look, you didn't hear this from me, but the last 3 times we found inventory short, the dispatch info came through Keller and Sons. I'm not saying what that means. I'm saying call your lawyer." He did. The lawyer listened and said the thing Ray needed him to say. "We can subpoena." Ray started a list of names. You learn, if you live long enough, that revenge is a sloppy word for what justice looks like when you've run out of polite options. Ray did not want to hurt anyone. He wanted his name back. He wanted to stand in a courtroom and say to a judge who didn't care, "I didn't do this." And have the judge care because the law sometimes can't avoid a clean story. He couldn't get his CDL back without the charges gone. He could, however, go to the yard where truckers he knew parked to swap stories and smoke they promised their wives they had quit. A driver named Tomas with a laugh so big it could startle birds told Ray Keller and Sons had switched shippers quietly last year on some routes. Then switched back when rates shifted. "Timing was weird," Tomas said. "Never got a clear answer. You hear about Mason?" "What about him?" "Up for promotion," Tomas said, rolling his eyes. "Guy's never had a bad day in his life." Ray nodded as if that were a weather report. He went home and spread his receipts again. He wrote a question at the top of a page. "Where is the leak?" He drew lines between refueling stops and the app timestamps and the engine control module numbers he'd stored because he'd liked the nerdy satisfaction of keeping spreadsheets no one else bothered with. He noticed that the ghost charges clustered near certain chains. He noticed the timestamps for the edits on his ELD came from IP addresses his nephew, the one good with computers, Told him we're allocated to a telecom provider used by a strip of office parks in Akron. He noticed that whenever his logs were changed, Mason had sent him a cheerful text 15 minutes later telling him, "Got you covered, old school." Ray built a wall of notes in the spare room. Nora watched from the doorway, quiet. "This isn't just about us, is it?" she said once. "It's about finishing a job," he said, and realized it was the most army thing he'd said in years. He called a former Keller driver, Rochelle, who had left 2 months before the incident and taken a job with a competitor. She met him at a diner off Route 21 on a wet Tuesday morning and ordered coffee black and bacon extra burned. She was 38 and could back a rig into a space on the first try while singing along to Old Country in a voice that made people turn and smile. "Derek's got 2 sets of books," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee like she was filing paperwork. "You didn't hear it from me. He's been leveraging a side operation off-books runs. A shell company. He sells the load twice, once legitimate, once to a reseller, skimming a few pallets each time. Not every load. Enough." Ray stared at the laminated menu. It was the kind of scheme you hear about and then immediately doubt because it requires both stupidity and nerve. "How does the ELD fit?" "Cover for seal brakes and timing," Rochelle said. "You hide a stop inside a 10. You file the edits. You send the driver a pat on the head and a thanks for hustling. If a driver notices, you say it's system error and give him a Walmart gift card at Christmas." Ray wrote that down. He paused. "Why'd you leave?" She watched traffic slide across the windows, the kind of gray day Ohio does too well. "I kept my head down until a driver out of Indiana got canned for a supposed fuel theft. He had pictures of the pump and the time and his gauge. He sent them HR. He CC'd me because I kept telling drivers to log everything. 6 weeks later, his wife posted a GoFundMe. He was stocking shelves nights. He used to run 22,000 miles a month. That's what made me leave. Not the theft. The way they treated him like a stain." Ray felt something in his chest then. A click he recognized from ranges and repair bays and quiet nights in truck stops when you know something is going to end and maybe you'll have a choice in how. "Can you help me prove it?" Rochelle looked at him over the coffee. She nodded once. They made a plan that wasn't a plan so much as a series of small, methodical steps designed to force pressure into the right places. Ray's attorney filed subpoenas for ELD change logs and dispatch records tied to specific loads, not just Ray's. Rochelle sent names of drivers who had quit quietly. Tomas introduced Ray to a mechanic who had been ordered to accidentally erase dashcam sensors on certain trailers and who had balked, then been demoted. Ray wrote a letter to the Illinois State's Attorney's Office and another to the U.S. Department of Transportation Office of Inspector General, careful and unemotional, attaching what he had, copies of ghost charges, ELD entries that moved by themselves, a log of Mason's texts, a spreadsheet with a pattern that was no longer a pattern but a shape. He did not sit and wait. He didn't know how to do that without rotting from the inside. He drove a forklift part-time at a lumberyard at the edge of town. He took the morning shift to be home when Nora got off at 6, the two of them standing in the kitchen eating over the sink like kids, laughing at nothing until one of them went quiet and they remembered why the laughter felt like borrowed money. He called Mason again and again until Mason picked up, late one night, voice drunk friendly. "Old school," he said. "What's the good word?" "Need to meet," Ray said. "In person." "Man, I'm slammed," Mason said. "Promotion, you know how it is." "I don't," Ray said. "Tonight." Silence. Then a chuckle. "Okay, sure. 10, the Waffle House on Arlington. And hey, don't bring." He didn't finish the sentence. He hung up. Ray told Nora where he was going. She put a hand on his chest and said, "Lo, be careful." He said he would. He meant it. At the Waffle House, Mason was already in a booth with his back to the wall, a habit he had learned from cop shows. He wore a hoodie under a pea coat and looked like a kid trying on adulthood. He grinned at Ray like they were buddies. "Get you some hash browns?" he said. Ray sat. He did not order. "You edited my logs," he said. Mason blinked slowly. "Company policy. Everyone does it." Ray slid a printed page across the table. It was a screenshot of a text exchange that did not know it had been saved elsewhere. Mason messaging a second number that belonged to a prepaid phone, sending load numbers and ETA windows. You sold pallets off my load, Ray said, voice flat. Mason's grin dried. He glanced toward the counter where a cook flipped something that spit grease. You don't know what you're talking about. Ray slid a second sheet. A fuel card report with a cluster of charges at a station Ray had never used. A station 2 exits from Keller's dispatch office. I know enough. Mason's eyes darted once to the door. What do you want? Names, Ray said. How it works. And then you're going to testify. Mason laughed then. A short burst, like a cough. You think anyone's going to believe you? You're already dirty. Ray leaned in just enough that Mason would have to decide whether to lean back. Mason did not. He watched Ray's eyes and saw something that made his throat move. I don't want your job, Ray said. I want my name, and I want Derek's operation off the road. Mason swallowed. He looked at the napkin holder, at the sugar packets, at the empty then not door. He sighed. You have no idea how deep it goes. Ray did not blink. Then enlighten me. Men like Mason talk when they are more afraid of silence than of you. He explained in little pieces like he was giving back coins he'd found in the couch cushions. Derek had a college friend with a warehouse nobody asked questions about. They had contacts at 2 shipping firms that looked the other way when a pallet went missing, because someone down the line got a cut. The ELD edits created plausible deniability, just enough time for a pull-off and swap. Fuel card skimming funded the side expenses because cash is cleaner when it's wearing a jacket with company logos in it. Mason moved the blocks around and took his taste. Why? Ray asked finally, when the coffee was cold and the waitress had stopped refilling it because she could tell this wasn't a night where anyone was going to tip well. You weren't starving. Mason looked 40 all of a sudden. That's the worst part, he said, honest, maybe for the first time. I was bored. It starts with one little thing and you don't die, so you try a bigger thing. And then you can't stop because you don't know what you'd be without it. Ray rubbed his jaw. He felt old in a way that wasn't about bones. You're going to write it down, he said. Dates, names, places, and you're going to email it to my lawyer. Derek will kill me, Mason said. And he didn't mean literally, but he meant it more than he didn't. He'll fire you, Ray said. He'll ruin you if he can. But he's going to be a little busy. He slid a card across the table with his lawyer's email. Tomorrow, he said. Mason nodded. He looked like a man who'd realized the little flame in his hand had been a fuse that led into his life. Tomorrow, he said, though nobody in that Waffle House believed time that way anymore. When the lawsuit landed, it landed in 2 places at once. Civil court, where Ray's attorney filed a claim for wrongful termination and defamation and damages, and criminal court, where the state's attorney, perhaps moved by the weight of subpoenas and the sudden appearance of a written statement from a dispatch supervisor named Mason, filed charges against Keller and Sons Logistics, Derek Keller, and a warehouse owner in Barberton whose name made the receptionist in the dispatcher's bullpen go white. The news moved through the trucking community fast, the way gossip and warnings always do. A local news crew stuck a microphone in Derek's face as he left the office, and he smiled thinly and said words like compliance and isolated incidents and we are cooperating fully. He did not say Ray's name. Rochelle texted Ray a thumbs up and then, get ready. They're going to be mean. She was right. Derek's attorney filed a countersuit accusing Ray of libel, claiming he had conspired to sabotage the company after being caught. Anonymous comments bloomed under news articles like mold, calling Ray a lifer who finally got caught, a wannabe hero, a loser. The house phone rang twice at night with no one there. A truck idled outside the house one afternoon long enough for Ray to step out on the porch and memorize the plate. He called a cop he knew, his neighbor's brother. Instead of carrying the old pistol he kept locked in a safe for the idea of safety more than the practice. The cop drove by twice over the next week and nodded at Ray with a look that said, I can't fix everything, but I see you trying to fix something. Nora kept the house warm and her voice steady in a way that made Ray understand what the words to have and to hold were meant to cover. Some nights she cried in the shower because the water made it seem private. Some mornings she poured his coffee and drew a heart in the condensation on the window. They had been married 26 years. they knew how to hold. The day before the preliminary hearing, Ray's son, Liam, came by, 22, shoulders still trying to figure out what shape a man should make. He hugged his father longer than he had in years. "I talked to Mom," he said. "I'm sorry I wasn't around. I didn't know how to deal." Ray nodded. "We're all learning." Liam sat at the kitchen table where Ray's papers had been and said he'd been reading about ELD data integrity. Ray smiled. "Of course you have," he said. And then, the thing he didn't realize he'd been carrying like a brick. "I need your help." So they worked. Liam made charts. Ray made phone calls. Nora made dinner and told them they were handsome when they were thinking. The house felt busy, not heavy. The hearing was a blur of voices and echoes. Ray sat in a suit that fit him like an apology and listened to lawyers say his name like it was a problem to be solved. He breathed the way the therapist had taught him, into the ribs, letting the breath press against the places that hurt. Mason testified in a voice that shook and then steadied. He named dates and loads and meetings in Derek's office where Derek had said, "We do this, we get ahead. Stay sharp." He handed over emails the company thought were gone. He handed over a second phone the company didn't know he had, with messages that were pictures of pallets, of seals, of cash. Derek's attorney tried to paint him as a disgruntled employee trying to save himself. Mason didn't deny it. "I am trying to save myself," he said, "by telling the truth." The judge raised an eyebrow, impressed or bored, it was hard to tell. Ray took the stand and did the hardest thing he knew. He told the truth without flinching. He told it plain, like a weather report. He did not add adjectives to make it sound better or worse. He said, "I didn't steal those pallets." He said, "I've kept clean logs for 30 years. I made a mistake once in 2001 and I've been living like a man who knows he can be wrong ever since." He stepped down and didn't look at Derek. He looked at Nora. She looked back like someone handing a man a rope on a steep path. The judge allowed the criminal charges to proceed. The civil suit got a date on a calendar that suddenly felt like a future again. Revenge, when it came, did not look like triumph. It looked like work. The state's attorney called more witnesses. The DOT did an audit that made Keller and Sons look like a basement after a flood. Drivers Ray had never met emailed his lawyer with their own stories, small and big, each one a rivet in a bridge. The local news interviewed Rochelle, who talked about dignity and the right to do honest work. Keller and Sons hemorrhaged clients. Derek fired back in the only way he knew, with money and noise. He hired a public relations firm that put out statements about his commitment to safety and drivers and his deep ties to the community. He threw a barbecue for the remaining staff with a bouncy house for their kids and a DJ who played songs about loving the USA. He stood next to the grill with a spatula like it was a microphone and talked to the camera about redemption. Ray watched the clip on his phone and said nothing. He went back to his notes because he had learned in the army and on the road that the best thing to do with fury is make it carry something heavy. The trial date arrived on a day so blue it felt sarcastic. Courtrooms are made to shrink people. Ray sat at the plaintiff's table next to his lawyer and felt his body try to become a smaller thing. He didn't let it. The testimony took a week. Mason again. Rochelle. The mechanic. A woman from the fuel card company who explained, with the kind of calm that scares guilty men, how skimming works, how they detect it, how the pattern at Keller and Sons had been a red flag they were one internal email away from acting on when the subpoena arrived. A digital forensics analyst explained ELD changelogs and IP trails that led back to a little cluster of offices in Akron. He said the word spoofing and then said, "But not very well." Derek took the stand and smiled and said he was sorry if administrative irregularities had harmed anyone, but he had no knowledge of wrongdoing. His voice had the tone of a man who has been told all his life that his voice is pleasant. Ray watched him and felt pity try to elbow its way into the room. He let it sit in the back, quiet. On the last day, Ray's attorney stood and said, "We don't get to choose what happens to us. We get to choose what we do with it." Mr. McKenna could have walked away. He chose to find the truth. He chose to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. He sat down. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. The jury found for Ray on every count. The judge awarded damages that would pay off the house and replace years of lost wages and put something in the bank that felt less like cash and more like recognition. He referred the criminal matters to sentencing. He spoke directly to Ray. "Mr. McKenna, this does not repair what was done to your name, but it acknowledges it." Outside, reporters wanted a quote. Ray said, "I'm going to take my wife to dinner." He took Nora's hand and they walked to the parking lot. The sky was still blue. Liam texted 3 heart emojis and a gif Ray didn't understand but appreciated for its enthusiasm. He could have ended it there. Many men would have. He could have taken the check and a deep breath and not thought of Keller and Sons again. But revenge, the good kind, the kind you can live with, isn't just about the moment the scales balance. It's about what you do after. Ray met with a group of drivers at a VFW hall on a Saturday afternoon. The smell of polish and beer embedded in the wood. He stood at a podium that had seen eulogies and raffle announcements and vowed to keep it simple. "Keep your receipts," he said. "Photograph your seals. Request your ELD changelogs monthly. Learn how to pull your ECM data. Make friends with tech people. Ask for help when something feels wrong." He met with the local community college and offered to guest lecture in their logistics program. He didn't like the phrase guest lecture. He preferred talk. He told the kids that boredom is sometimes the most dangerous thing in a job. He told them that the best coworker you'll ever have is the one who sends you a photo of a seal number without being asked. He sat with lawmakers at the State House because Rochelle knew somebody who knew a committee chair. He told them how easy it was to hide theft inside software and how hard it was for an individual driver to fight a company alone. He did not enjoy politics. He enjoyed being useful. Keller and Sons went under. Derek pleaded to lesser charges on advice his attorney gave him in a hallway that smelled like old coffee. He paid fines and lost the business his father had built by actually caring. He moved to Florida, according to gossip, to sell boats to men who liked the idea of wind more than wind itself. Mason avoided jail barely because his testimony had been one of the first bricks in the wall that fell on Derek. He left Akron. He sent Ray a letter from somewhere west, postmarked with a cactus. It said, "I'm trying to be a better man. I don't expect you to believe me. Thank you for not burning the whole thing down." Ray put the letter in a drawer with his small collection of things he didn't know what to do with but couldn't throw away. Ray took a job managing safety and compliance for a small family-run trucking company in Canton. The owner was a woman whose grandfather had started with 2 flatbeds and a handshake. She paid her drivers well, within reason, and she didn't mind when Ray was stubborn about paperwork. "We hired you to be stubborn," she said, signing a check. He didn't get back in a cab right away. He drove a pickup with a logo on the door and visited way stations like a man visiting old teachers. He talked to troopers who were polite and busy and weary and kind. He brought donuts once and they made him promise never to do that again because the gifts looked bad, and then one of them ate 2 anyway and winked. Nora and Ray sat on their porch in the evenings with the lemon tree in its pot, leaves glossy and impossible. "We should plant it," Ray would say, and Nora would say, "It'll die." And they'd both laugh because it was the kind of joke that tells the truth sideways. One Sunday in late summer, he woke before dawn and drove Liam to the airport for a trip west with friends. The roads were empty in that way that makes you think of old songs. Liam dozed against the window. At a red light, Ray looked at his son's reflection and felt something unclench. Life didn't become simple. It became honest again. On the way back, he took the long route, past the edge of town where the fields start and the smell of silage can make you believe there are seasons left that still know what to do with themselves. He pulled over at a wide spot on the road and watched the light come up, thin and then certain. He thought of all the nights he had slept in his cab and woken to this exact light in 36 states. He thought of the chain a man throws over a load and the way it sings when it's tight just right. He breathed deep in the ribs. There was no audience, no judge. Just the sound of birds and a far truck you could hear before you could see. He took out his phone and texted Rochelle, thinking of starting a driver's clinic. 3 Saturdays. Paperwork and Self-Defense 101, the legal kind. "You in?" Her reply came quick, "I'm in, and I'm stealing that title." He started the truck and pulled back onto the road. Off to his right, the taller stacks of the old mill were still there, rusting gracefully. Ahead, the interstate waited like a promise you can keep because you've learned how. The clinic met in the back room of a church in September. 22 drivers showed the first week, then 40 the next, then 60. Some were old hands with faces like maps. Some were young and restless and impatient. Ray brought in a woman from the DOT who knew more about ELD data than anyone should, and a lawyer who looked sleepy until he started talking, and a cybersecurity kid, Liam's friend, a surprise, who showed them how to archive texts and backup logs so that a glitch couldn't erase their days. They practiced role-playing polite refusals to illegal requests. They wrote scripts for emails to HR. They made a WhatsApp group for alerts about scams. They swapped stories and cards and job leads. Ray watched the room fill with a kind of energy he'd missed. Not anger. Not fear. Something like competence braided with solidarity. On the final Saturday, a driver stood up. He was in his 60s, his hands like tree roots. He said, "I've been on the road since Reagan. Never thought I'd have to learn the cloud. But I did thanks to you. And last week a kid at dispatch tried to tell me to tuck an hour into my sleeper that I didn't sleep. And I said no. And I sent him the policy. And he backed off. And I slept like a baby." The room laughed. Ray laughed too. His chest felt like it was expanding into a space that had been closed a while. "That," he said, "is the whole game." They took a photo, everyone squinting, the kind of photo you print and pin, not because the light is flattering but because the memory is. After, Ray cleaned up coffee cups with Nora, who had done the sign-in and hugged more people than Ray thought possible. She slid a hand into his back pocket and left it there. An old habit. "You know," she said, "this is revenge." He looked at her. She wasn't teasing. "How do you mean?" "Not the court. Not the money. Not Derek going wherever men like him go. This, making a thing so that what happened to you is less likely to happen to them." She gestured at the empty room, the marker boards, the handouts in neat stacks. "It's the only kind that lasts." He thought of the word revenge, and how sharp it had felt when all this began. He thought of how dull it felt now and how useful. He nodded. "I can live with that." They turned off the lights and locked the door. Outside, the afternoon had that September clarity, the kind that makes edges look honest. They drove home past the railroad crossing just as a freight rumbled through. A line of cars so long it felt like time. Metal wheels clicking a rhythm anyone who has ever hauled anything can hear in his bones. At home, Ray went to the spare room. He stood in front of the wall where his notes had been and looked at the bare paint. He took a thumbtack he'd left in the molding and pressed it into the wall for no reason other than the sound it made. He put the lemon tree out on the porch because the forecast said warm. That evening they ate grilled chicken and bad corn on the cob and drank iced tea gone weak in the pitcher. The neighbor's dog chased a squirrel like a story you've heard before but don't mind hearing again. Ray's phone buzzed with a text from the attorney. Settlement processed. He didn't feel triumph. He felt ready. He looked at Nora's profile in the low light and thought, not for the first time, that she had saved him by believing he could save himself. Later, as the sky turned the color he'd always thought of as end-of-day blue, he walked down to the basement and opened the safe. He took out the old pistol. He cleaned it because it was his habit and because care feels like prayer when you don't want to say words. He put it back. He locked the safe. He sat on the bottom stair and listened to the house settling. He listened to a far train. He listened to his own breath. He thought of a trooper tapping on his sleeper door all those months ago and the way the world tilted for a while. He thought of a different tap, the pencil against paper the first night he wrote everything down, and how that had been the first nudge back. "Hey!" Nora called from upstairs, soft, like they were in their 20s again. "You coming up?" "Yeah," he said. He stood. He turned off the light. He took the steps one by one, not like a man who had almost lost his name, but like a man who had learned all over again what it was worth.